He always thought their marriage was sincere and their love was deep, but in her last moments, his wife revealed what she had been keeping hidden her whole life. The year's life was in 1955, when the globe was split along racial lines. The U.S. continued to cling to the Jim Crow laws, and the shackles of racial segregation determined where a black man may dine, sit, stroll, or even look. Interracial partnerships were risky in addition to being discouraged. A black man who was found with a white lady in the wrong location may be whipped, imprisoned, or worse. The South was especially harsh in enforcing these unwritten laws, while the North was still without Haven Oliver Bryant, despite being less harsh, had acquired these skills as a young man who was raised in a tiny southern town amid poverty, had spent his whole life seeing men like his father suffer because of a sister who was meant to keep them down. His mother was a weary lady who spent more time cleaning floors in white houses than in factories, and his father had worked in factories. Oliver, her own son, has been working as a vehicle mechanic since he could walk. Uncles were taught how engines breathed and moaned as they worked by. By the time he was 18, he was working as a mechanic at a modest car dealership. Oliver was tall and had one of the few positions where a black guy could make a decent livelihood without having to work directly for a white boss. He had a calm assurance that worried me, and his complexion was as black as polished mahogany. In the environment he lived in, white males and attractive white women were a hazardous mix, but Oliver had never been. He was stupid enough to consider such risks after seeing what happened to, prior to Sarah, black guys would often leave their eyes on white flesh. Sarah Whitmore, who was born into a wealthy white family, had never seen hardship, had grown up wearing pricey shoes and silk gowns, and her days were planned with social gatherings and etiquette, classes intended to shape her into the ideal Southern bride. Her father, Charles Whitmore, was a powerful businessman, whose fortune came from more than merely from investments, but also from his influence over people he trusted. The supremacy of those who shared his bloodlines and purity skin tone. But Sarah had never felt comfortable in her father's environment, despite having developed up feeling suffocated by the demands she didn't want to fulfill. She should have been calm, submissive, and modest, but instead she was restless and inquisitive, always looking for something more than the ideal existence that was set out for her. The summer heat clung to her skin the night she met Oliver, when she was 18. She put on a dress that was deemed overly daring and air-revealing. As she stepped into the darkened basement where jazz music played, she could smell the odor of alcohol and cigarette smoke, electric and silky tones that snake around the boundaries of division. Like a hint of one of the rare venues where young people's racial lines blurred was the Defiance Party. Black, white, and all other races gathered for a covert sharing session. Beverages, giggles, and looks that are impossible to share. When Oliver first saw her in the sunshine there, she was quite different from the white. When the woman he had been warned about met his gaze, there was no uncertainty in her eyes and no sign of fear. Her golden hair fell over her shoulders as she approached him. Al's blue eyes shine with a deadly curiosity and eagerness. She questioned his name in defiance, and as he hesitated, she grinned, and Oliver discovered, speaking in a low, cautious tone as if he were testing the air between. They spoke for hours, their words effortlessly gliding into the void between them, and she was enthralled with the he, seemed cautious yet interested by the way he talked and the country he came from, by her audacity and the way she seemed to be immune to the terror that controlled his own life, which was exhilarating, stupid, and she informed him she wanted to see him again at the end of the night, which he knew was unavoidable. When her father first saw them together, he should have left, but he didn't. Oliver had been working late at the car business when Sarah showed up at the scene of the accident. His heart tightened as he looked at the edge of the garage, her pale complexion lit by the street lamp. She shouldn't have been there since it wasn't safe, thundering in his ears and around his pulse. However, a black sedan drew up to the curb before he could usher her away. Charles. When Whitmore left, everything seemed to halt, and Oliver witnessed the epiphany, came to light in the man's eyes, the way his body and face twisted in rage. Sarah wanted to speak, but she was tight with the type of fury that only white males could convey. With an icy gaze that might have frozen the July air, the father hushed her. Then, without saying another word, He snatched Oliver didn't move because he knew better than to grab her by the arm and yank her away. To follow, he discovered a message hidden inside the garage door the next morning. "Stay away from my daughter," was a threat rather than a warning, and for the first time in his life, Oliver knew. He came to the realization that he was terrified of among the risks he was prepared to take for Sarah during the next weeks were hell. Sarah was not allowed to leave the home, and everyone was watching her every step. Her father avoided talking to her on every phone conversation that was tracked, as if admitting her existence would. Sarah attempted to resist, but her mother only watched her with inscrutable eyes and said nothing, shouted, yelled, and pleaded. But the law was her father's will, and no court would support a daughter who had the audacity to challenge the guy who controlled her life. Yet she managed to write a letter, whispered in a maid's ear and tucked into a delivery boy's pocket. Having already experienced love across color boundaries during a late-night meeting when everything was, she discovered Oliver again while he was sleeping, and this time she informed him of what he already knew. She had made her decision, but her father would never let them to be together, and she had picked him. It was a hazardous and careless choice on the part of a white lady. There, fleeing with a black guy was illegal, in addition to being embarrassing, would be without understanding, forgiveness, or compassion. But love had never given a damn about laws, and so with only their clothing on their backs in the middle of night, with the blaze inside their souls, they fled the restraints of her father's strength, from the burden of a world that would never embrace them. They fled in that direction. A future with no assurances, no security, only the hope that together they were able to establish their own lives, although they were unaware of the true. The night air was heavy with the weight of their choice. Sarah's hands, and danger, had only just began. She shuddered as she gripped the little luggage she had secretly packed, which included just a garment and the minimal necessities. She took a few money and a picture of her mother, but she didn't know why. It was ridiculous how little of her. She could take what she knew about her home and her name with her. Status she was abandoning. Oliver stood on the outskirts of the city. He was waiting in the shadows of the deserted train station without a bag. His life's worth of photos had always been manageable to tote, but when she saw, she wanted to rush to embrace him and let the terror out of her fade away. But she kept herself upright since there was no time for tenderness. They only had one opportunity to vanish from the train that would carry them if they hesitated. It was a freight train headed for an industrial town, and it was expected in an hour. Although it was not against the law, mixed-race marriages were uncommon in Illinois. Greatest choice, Sarah took one more look behind her, partly expecting to see her father's men rushing at her and pulling her back to her just-abandoned life. Oliver gripped her hand roughly. Yet even though the streets were deserted, the terror persisted. Sarah swallowed the words, callous, steady, and, "Are you sure?" His voice was quiet but firm. She nodded, and had a knot in her throat before they got on the train and hid amid the containers and grain bags. Nobody saw them go, and nobody knew their destination. Sarah was free for the first time in her life, but it was a difficult and drawn-out trip. Their bodies were tense from crouching in the little area between goods as they went in the dark. Every clank, the sound of the train wheels clattered through Sarah's bones. Oliver seldom talked, serving as a constant reminder that there was no going back. He was continually looking and listening whenever the train stopped. Anxious as they waited for the doors to swing open and show armed soldiers and the sound of approaching footsteps, prepared to rip them to pieces. But nobody arrived on the second. By the time they arrived in Illinois, the industrial town was a long cry from the sophisticated. The streets of Sarah's early years were laced with soot and the air was heavy with smoke. Buildings. The workers were exhausted after hard workdays, but they were only. No one gave a white lady standing next to a pair another glance for the black guy. It was apathy rather than acceptance, and indifference was sufficient. They were able to get lodging at a small boarding house where the walls were slender. Their room was hardly large, and they had little solitude. Plenty for the little bed they shared, but it was theirs. Oliver accepted a position due to the intense heat and 12-hour hours at the nearby steel factory. Sarah was able to get employment as a seamstress. Long hours of sewing left her fingers burned. It was exhausting and nothing compared to her previous existence, yet she never voiced any complaints since when she originally made this decision, the marriage ceremony was held in a small church There were only the two of them on the outskirts of town, with no visitors, flowers, or music of them, and a priest who was observing them as he recited the vows without a ring. Only a silent exchange of vows made not for the public but for the celebration. After the ceremony, Sarah stood outside the church and stared at each other. She was no longer Sarah Whitmore as she looked up at the sky and felt the weight of the moment descend on her chest. Sarah Bryant, a privileged girl, was married to a black man in a. She felt lighter than ever in a world that would never completely welcome them, had lived in a test industrial town prior to their first year of marriage, which was safer than the South, but it did not imply it was. Sincere Oliver's co-workers avoided him since they weren't sure how to react to the thieving guy who had a white wife. The town's ladies gazed at Sarah with wide eyes, not knowing whether she was confused or just stupid, but they accepted it, but never welcomed. And on some evenings they went to bed since money was always scarce. Sarah, who was starving, learned how to fix clothing until it was more stitched. Then Oliver discovered how to make every dollar extend by haggling for leftovers at the market till his body ached. Yet they persevered because of love, had brought them thus far. But love did not make Sarah's father's worry go away. Her letters, which were cooler than the others, were delivered to the boarding house. Last but not least, the first was an order to return home, and the second was a warning not to. Recognize that the third was a threat, and you will regret it, Sarah. Burnt them, all, but her father was not a guy who was willing to tolerate it. Nevertheless, he would eventually track her down, and she was unsure of what he would do. Did that terror whisper in the back of her mind and infiltrate her dreams? Remembers the time she heard footsteps in the market and saw guys in suits staring at her for too long, behind her at night. So she started saving without informing Oliver. Initially, there were just a few pennies hidden under the mattress. Then, a few. She assured herself that the dollars concealed in the hem of her garment were nothing more than a prudence, a behavior rooted in dread rather than uncertainty. Yet she knew in her heart that, fact, even though she had decided on Oliver, she still had a worry that one day she must leave him behind. The years went by, and the manufacturing town's way of life became predictable, was never really comfortable or easy, but Oliver gave it his all for them. With soot-stained hands and straining muscles, Sarah sewed clothing every night until her once delicate hands, now rough with calluses, bled as they forged a life together. When the first kid arrived, Sarah had never experienced serenity by uneasy peace. Joy was much more frightened than she had anticipated when she would place her infant in Oliver's arms and experience their family's love as they grow. But when she saw the little kid bundled in blankets, she had a very different emotion. Guilt, since she kept thinking about her kid when she was staring at her son. She had been 17 when she was abandoned, a different girl living a different life. Her family had hidden her behind closed doors and kept the pregnancy a secret. Informing friends and family that she had been unwell and needed to rest had never had a choice when the kid who was born was this one. Her father had hardly given her permission to hold him when he was whisked away. Made all the arrangements, including a covert payment and a secret adoption, to guarantee there would. Sarah had been crying for weeks, but there were no records or connections to the Whitmore name. However, she eventually learned to quiet the pain, telling herself that it was best for the kid, who would have a happier existence without her. The weight of scandal. But after meeting Oliver, she buried that history under a new one, clutching her newborn boy in her arms despite finding a new love. The previous claw in the past? She had a son who had been lost before he was born, even got to know her. She never confided in Oliver that she couldn't bear the burden of. Their baby Isaac grew quickly after that lie became ingrained in her bones, leaving her with a silent, nagging regret that never completely went away. His eyes are as keen as his father's, and his skin is a rich blend of his parents' hues. He was the first thing they had ever really made together as a living, and he had a grin as kind as his mother's, demonstrating their love, but Sarah was unable to get rid of the sensing of void. She had a dream about the kid she had given. She pondered if he resembled Isaac, if he had her nose. Oliver's unwavering look made her question whether he ever considered the mother he had never seen. She buried it deeper and dedicated herself to it, but she never mentioned it. To Oliver, Isaac, and their lives. But the past has a way of resurfacing even years went by as you attempted to outrun it. And a new kid was born. Margaret was boisterous and fearless from the beginning. Her laughter, feeling she lacked her mother's tenderness amid the small spaces of their boarding home. She was a force unto herself, a storm, and a bit louder than her father. Sarah loved the girl's physique, but the secret became bigger every year. Heavier. She saw the kid as a young man today, maybe in an unidentified city, perhaps wondering who he was. She hoped that he would be in a home similar to theirs, had been blessed with a happy life, and she hoped that he had never felt alone. Hoped Oliver wouldn't know, but secrets had a way of ruining everything. Oliver first saw that Sarah was becoming quieter and more aloof, and he initially assumed it was fatigue. Their lives was difficult, and parenthood was challenging. But then he saw it was the way she would ponder before responding, and how she would gaze out into space. Inquiries regarding her history and the way she recoiled even in passing when adoption was brought up. Oliver was not a guy whose silence was honored by pride, who recognized that certain wounds were too deep to address. This was different, however, since this was his wife, and she was moving away from him. He discovered her seated at the little wooden table in their kitchen long after the kids had gone to bed, looking at a ripped piece of cloth on her lap. She first failed to see him, and for the Oliver was afraid of the gap he felt between them for the first time in their marriage, since there were things she wasn't telling him, things she wouldn't, and he first questioned if he'd any real knowledge of his wife. Sarah had always understood that marriage was not, that she had heard the fairy tale from books and movies since she was a little girl. Knew survival and love were often two different things. But she had never anticipated. Oliver was a decent spouse who was patient and solid in a marriage based on both of them. Trustworthy. He put in a lot of effort to support her and the kids, never ever lamenting the weariness that arrived with 12-hour shifts at the steel factory. And she was sure that he loved her. About that. But she had a secret that was more burdensome than any love could lighten, since she didn't marry him out of love. Instead, she had grown up knowing that her father would choose her, so she did it out of dread. For her husband, it was the norm among households like hers in the Old South. Women did not choose bloodlines that were linked to colonial prosperity. Her father had spent years preparing her for marriage before they were selected. Introducing. He had arranged them like racing horses and presented her to the sons of bankers, attorneys, and merchants, examining them for riches, ancestry, and the proper amount of haughtiness, and she had cooperated, had nodded and smiled, allowing them to grab her hand and guide her over the ballroom floors. She had followed protocol up until Oliver, when she saw something distinct, a guy who made her feel special, yet did not belong in her world. She had rushed to him because she wanted to challenge all she had been taught, not because she'd cherished him, but because she was afraid of what her life might turn out to be. If she didn't, the knowledge made her ill, because now, after all these years, she did adore him, and she cherished the way he gave her a forehead kiss before heading out to work. She loved the way he rocked their kids to sleep at night every morning, and she adored the way he never elevated her. Deep as the earth's rumble, she cherished the way he made her feel even when he was furious, safe. But she had never been honest with him about it while they were married. Had been a decision of survival rather than a decision of the heart. She assured herself. It didn't matter how their narrative unfolded, since love had arrived in due time. Had started so long that it brought them here. But the Whispers, who weren't from Oliver, but from their surroundings, including the market ladies who still scoffed and gazed at her as if she had gone insane from the men, who Oliver walked by the kids on the street who asked her questions, but she wasn't sure how to respond. Explain, Mama, why some people act as if Dad Pie doesn't. The other kids remark, I'm different, Mama, so why doesn't Grandpa ever feel like he belongs? Visit, and she was unable to respond, since the reality was. However, the reality was that she had never ceased trying to forget her origins for so long. to consider what living in the space between two worlds meant for her kids. And worst of all, she had never informed Oliver that during the first months when everything were, sometimes when she was terrified and tired, she had considered before departing. She had examined the cash she had stashed away, totaled it, and wondering in the stillness of the night whether it was sufficient to remove the kids and vanish. She had never intended to do so, but the thought of it still troubled her. Oliver wasn't a fool. He could see that she avoided certain. He saw how she paused when he inquired about her background and how she became silent when their kids discussed race and belonging to the things that separated them. And he pondered not just what her secrets were, but also what her love had done. She loved him either because he was her only escape or because he was her option. He was hesitant to pose the question since he wasn't sure he wanted to hear Sarah's convincing argument. She had created a new life, a family, and a modest but secure house, putting the past behind her. Their walls continued to stare at them suspiciously, but they had discovered something that was almost peaceful within. Delicate, and history had a way of resurfacing when you least expected it. The first letter came on a typical. She was out shopping in the afternoon when it was slid under the door. She gazed at the envelope for a while, it lying on the hardwood floor like a ghost from another existence. Her name and handwriting were all that was written before she picked it up. There was no return address. It was clearly her father's, and when she ripped it open, the words made her stomach turn. She felt chilly within, and she didn't comprehend what you had done. Unwell. She had fled for years and hadn't heard from him since. He had sent letters requesting she return home and then threatened to her. She had assumed that he had given up, but she had been mistaken. She waited for another letter for weeks, but it never arrived, so she attempted to push it from her thoughts, but it felt like a stone pressing down on her chest. What did he mean? Was it just... She persuaded herself not to worry since it was either another effort to manipulate her or something worse. Then, in the early evening, she spotted the guy she had brought the kids to as she bartered for fresh milk and potatoes. The market allowed them to chase one other between the stalls, and then she saw, standing at the corner of the street, was a white guy wearing a suit, although he wasn't. He was observing her and not talking to anybody, so he wasn't purchasing anything. A chill went through him. She convinced herself that she was dreaming, but the next day she saw him once more, and the next day she watched him from a distance. Didn't inform Oliver that she was aware of what he would say. You're seeing things. Worrying over nothing, or worse, if your father is involved. We must confront him, but all she wanted was for him to remain in the past, where he was supposed to be. But when the second letter arrived, it was different, and came from her father. It came from someone she never thought she would hear from again. Her heart stopped as she read it again, since the penmanship was strange. Despite the ambiguity of the message, she was aware that someone had discovered her first kid about her long-forgotten son, a secret she had buried so deeply that it had almost been forgotten. And now that someone knew, she sensed her world's barriers were starting to crumble. She didn't say anything for days, slept very little, and ate very little. Oliver saw that she assured him it was nothing when he asked her what was wrong, but he knew better. And when she could see the change in his eyes as he discovered the letter grumped and concealed in the bottom of her dresser drawer, understanding that there were aspects of her that he was unaware of, and maybe after. Despite the fact that he had never met his wife, Sarah had always known that she had spent years telling herself that one day the past will come up with her, that the life she left behind and the one she had created were different, that the woman she had been, the Charles Whitmore's affluent daughter, who was too scared to stand up for her first kid, the bride, who had fled into Oliver's arms in despair rather than love, had vanished. But in reality, the lady had been lurking within her all along. She waited in the back of her mind for the time to confront all she had interred, and now that her body had deceived her and time was pressing down on, her bones told her that the time had arrived and the illness had begun with a sluggish cough. She hadn't taken the dizziness seriously at first, but then the pain started to. Her chest ached sharply and persistently, preventing her from breathing and making even the most basic motions difficult. Oliver first became aware of it when he saw her strain to raise the iron. Pot from the burner saw her flinching when she believed nobody was. He didn't say anything at first, but one night she passed out on the ground. He realized they couldn't ignore it any longer while folding clothes, and the doctor arrived the next morning. A middle-aged white man's expression was inscrutable as he pushed his fingers to. He answered Sarah questions while listening to the beat of her pulse and nodding. When he talked, his tone was cool, and he scowled at her responses to her quiet, too composed. She had already seen that kind of composure that mitigated unpleasant news. It was her heart, he added, seeming to be nice but unable to provide any solutions while she was dying. Oliver stood there with his hands, his strength waning and nothing to do. Sarah closed her eyes, clenching at his sides. She had anticipated terror, yet all she felt was fatigue since she had spent so many years escaping from so many things. Oliver refused to accept it and spent days looking for a different doctor, another solution, and maybe it was time to quit. Hope, but the response was always the same. She understood more than anything that she could not do, and her time was running short. Go from this earth without speaking the truth. She had lived her whole life concealing secrets. It was time to release them. She urged Oliver to stay with her in the evening as the sun sank below the roofs, but he first objected since he was terrified of her because of something strange in her voice. Dying, but before saying that, she filled him in on everything about the fun she had concealed on how in the early years of their marriage, she terrified that one day she would question him, doubt their life together, and would have to go. She informed him about her first kid, a boy whom she had left behind. She had grown up telling him about her father and how he had managed to keep reminding her that she had never really been free of him. And at last she revealed to him the most terrible fact of all. She had not married him out of love, had married him out of fear as he had served as her escape, rather than her. Oliver sat in quiet, and she was unable to interpret his face. She felt the tears fall down her cheeks whether he was angry, hurt, or not at all. The burden of a lifetime of shame pressed on her cheeks, and then she revealed to him the only. She was aware that in spite of all, even if the secrets and errors she had made led her to love him more than, she had always believed that she could love him, and she prayed that in the end, after that, Oliver says, I took care of her, I held her. And the days became hazy. When the agony became unbearable, she cleaned her forehead. When the fever struck, she was brought to bed since her legs were no longer able to support her, but he kept his feelings to himself. She didn't ask, so he didn't feel the need to be aware, since it ultimately didn't matter that he remained there and for her one night, when the cold seeped into the home and her body's weight became too great to bear. That was sufficient. She felt Oliver's arms around her, and he muttered something so kind that she hardly heard it, and she smiled as she closed her eyes for the last time, because she was aware at the time that he had either forgiven her or not. Perhaps it didn't matter. Perhaps perfection wasn't important in love. Perhaps it had to do with deciding to remain when it hurt, even if the past might never be undone, even if the home was too far gone to say farewell. Silent, the kind of silence that crept into the walls, between the weight of a body and breathes. Oliver sat in the silence of their lives, knowing that Sarah would never rise again. Bedroom, looking at the vacant area next to him, and the pillow, that still contained the smallest trace of her head for days without moving it, as if by he might fool himself into thinking she was still there if he left things alone. But the reality was, she was unavoidable. She had left him with a lifetime of secrets. Her disclosure had caused him to feel something, not because she had lied, but because throughout all the years they had spent together, he had never really thought. He had believed in her during the time they had spent together, felt that their relationship had always been genuine and had been founded on trust rather than need, and he was unsure of what to believe now that their lives had been a lie. Had he always been a means of escape, sanctuary, or acceptance, or had she ever really choose him? He had fought his whole life to be accepted as a man in a society that saw him as less than human, leaving behind a life she did not desire. Before that made him feel inadequate, and now even at the location he had called home, even as the lady he had loved held him, he wondered whether he had ever really belonged. The letters remained, even the ones from her father, which had become yellow with age concealed in the drawer where she had concealed the dangers, the warnings, followed by the last one that had broken. Her in those last weeks, I recognize you, but your handwriting is different and her terror was different. Never explained its meaning to him, but he had to know now. So he unlocked the drawer and with trembling fingers he extracted the pile of ancient documents and unfolded each one individually. The last letter was a succinct. Oliver froze the room, tilted as he read the single words, "Your son is looking for you." His breath caught in his throat as he repeated the words. Their son, not Isaac. Not he had never met Margaret, the person she had given away. There had been another youngster, and his fists were clenched around the paper. A son who had been looking was another aspect of her that she had concealed from him, seeking clarification, and now that she was gone, everything. Oliver sat in quiet as he considered the questions that remained unanswered, gazing at the letter, absorbing the reality of a life he had never really experienced, and for the first time since her passing, he allowed himself to mourn not just for Sarah, but for the life they had created, which he had believed to be genuine. He now understood that the mansion was haunted by ghosts, seemed different in her absence. It wasn't only the silence, the lack of her voice, or the soft rustle of her motions in the kitchen as she hummed to herself or folded laundry. It was something more profound, was the burden of all that was left. Unspoken, Oliver had thought he knew his wife for decades, thinking that their relationship was really unbreakable. Now, in the days after her passing, that conviction was disintegrating like sand passing through his. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of his fingers saying, "Your kid is Sarah." The words "looking for you" seemed like a wound that would never stop bleeding, had been harboring this truth for years, allowing it to fester inside her. She had never told him, so Oliver clenched his hands and stared at. How could she sit across from him at the dinner with the fading ink table each evening, knowing that she had a kid of her own? How could she see their kids develop and never mention his name? Had she intended to kidnap? She had revealed a great deal about this mystery to the grave before she passed away. Financial uncertainty and the fact that she had not, at the very least, married him out of love. Not initially, but she kept it, and Oliver now had to deal with it. Isaac and Margaret were mourning alone and didn't realize it, but their suffering was distinct from theirs. Sarah had been a dependable and consistent mother. She had been Oliver's companion and the focus of their universe, the lady he had battled for and trusted beyond all others in his home. At this point, he was uncertain about what had been genuine and what had been a meticulous. Even if it had begun as a deception, he was unaware that the created illusion was still love, and he couldn't decide whether he wanted to learn how many days Oliver worked, since it was the steel factory was the only thing that made sense. It cared about sorrow, that his world had changed under his feet, that his wife was no longer there, and that it needed daily routine, his strength, his time, and his perspiration, which was at least straightforward. But when he felt the weight of others' quiet stares on him while he was walking through the market, nothing else was. Questions lingering in the air rather than when he grabbed for her out of habit while lying in bed at night. To when he opened the drawer and saw the letter waiting for him, he didn't find the sheets cold and empty. One evening after the kids were gone, he was taunted with the reality he wasn't sure he was prepared to confront. Dozing off, he sat at the table and unfolded the letter once again, but this time there was no name. Discuss a single harsh truth, a son who is searching for clarification, and Oliver was all that remained to offer them, and after weeks of struggling with, what good, what did this guy owe a stranger, and would it be worthwhile to search for him, had never been in their lifetimes, but then an additional idea occurred to them. What if someone had taken Isaac's kid away, erased him, and made him a secret from him? Wouldn't he deserve to know? Therefore, one morning before Oliver left the home, when the sun had completely risen and made his way to the post office, he gripped the letter tightly, and for the first time since Sarah's passing, he made the choice to track down this youngster and tell him the stolen truth. From him, regardless of how painful it was or how much it altered everything, as the past had already taken excessively, and Oliver refused to allow it to take any more.